Thank you for tuning into our first episode of the Monday After Preachers podcast, where our focus is on holistic health in an evolving climate. I'm excited because this is our first show and I have a special guest. I wanted to start this podcast off with an amazing guest. We have a great show in store for you. I ask that you tune in. My first guest is by far one of the smartest guys that I know. I met him back in 2019, and his knowledge, his insight was so incredible. I knew I had to bring him on as our first guest. He wears so many hats. He has his doctorate in ministry. He is a bishop for the Full Gospel Baptist Church organization. He's a pastor. He is the pastor of the Tabernacle of the Lord's Church, the dwelling place for a family of faith growing in grace there in Baltimore. He's an author of a great book entitled Critical Collaboration. He's a professor, musician, songwriter. His music has been recorded by artists such as Edmund Hawkins, Bishop T.D. Jakes. All of us know Bishop T.D. Jakes and the Potter's House Mass Choir and a host of other artists. And he serves, of course, as I mentioned, he serves as the state bishop of Maryland for the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship. He's a husband, father. Bishop, are you a grandfather? I don't want to push you any further than you are. All right. He's a grandfather as well. Bishop said he's a father. He has his doctorate in ministry and is it in family therapy?
That's correct.
Family therapy from Golden Conwell Theological Seminary, and he has a Master's of Divinity from the Howard University. The reason I mentioned that last is because I'm pursuing my Master's in Divinity, and it's been a challenging feat thus far with everything else. So Bishop, I have to lean on you there. Welcome to the show, Bishop Guy Robinson. How are you?
Pastor Spry, great day to you. I am grateful and excited and honored to be here.
Yes, sir. Thank you for consenting to come on this inaugural show. Before we get into this particular conversation, Bishop, I want to ask you, what do you do? What are some of your intentional practices to ensure your holistic health before we get into this particular conversation?
Oh boy, that's already a powerful question. Put me right on the hot seat. I say that because in the words of Paul, I count not myself to have apprehended.
Yeah.
I have not mastered it, but I try to, if I had to put them in a homiletical alliteration, kind of make it make, move, meet, motivate, meditate rather, meaning creativity. There's therapeutic power in creative process.
Wow.
So whether it is writing a book or painting or whatever that creative outlet is, I encourage everyone to have one way in which you make. It taps us in to the divine activity of God who created in the beginning. And so, that's the make sense. And psychologically, it gives us a modicum of control, if you will, over things that we do have the ability to change. So move means exercise. The psychosomatic or mind-body connection is quite profound. And exercise has actually been found to release endorphins and other chemicals in the body that are natural antidepressants.
Wow.
So make, move, meet means to be social. We were not, as the scripture says, not good for us to be alone. Scientific way to put that is to have circles of accountability and friendship, peers, proteges, mentors, all that kind of thing. And so I think that's so very important to us because we are social individuals.
Right.
We would literally have some serious mental health concerns if did not connect with people. In fact, antisocial behavior is a mental health concern. And so, and then lastly is to meditate. That's to be spiritually grounded. I don't mean in the New Age sense, but I mean in the Psalm 1 sense, is blessed is the man whose delight is in the law of the Lord. And in that word does he meditate. Just time to develop our spiritual development and disciplines.
Wow. See, as you can see, Bishop coming out swinging. That's why I knew he was the perfect guest for this particular first show. Bishop, let's get into the conversation. As I was meditating and praying about this first show, I really wanted to join a conversation that I believe has already begun and just kind of want to join in the conversation about just holistic health as it relates to the clergy community and how we how we deal and how we cope and how we, not so much in the vocational part, because I think we have enough conferences and teachings and stuff like that for us to be functional in our vocation. But as the individual, it's like the Superman Clark Kent type analogy where, we focus on the superhero in the pulpit, but we have to really focus on the person behind the scenes that go home and deal with certain things. So today I want to talk about how does unhealed trauma affect the preacher, the pastor, the person who stands before individuals giving a word of hope, but yet they're dealing with their own trauma that has been unaddressed and just suffering. How does one deal with unhealed trauma, or how does it affect the preacher, rather, unhealed trauma?
Oh, wow. Pastor Spy, I'll start with an APA definition of trauma. American Psychological Association defines trauma as an emotional response to an injurious event. So it hurt. And the idea is that just as, of course, there's a such thing as physical trauma, but just as our bodies can be wounded, bones can be broken, and the body can experience pain, so too can the mind, will, and emotions. And so when we're dealing with this idea of the only difference is we're more apt or prone to seek treatment for the physical trauma than we are for the psychological trauma. But trauma is real. And just like it can happen to anybody physically, it can happen to anybody emotionally, or psychologically, including preachers. We are not exempt from traumatic experiences. We see it throughout the scriptures, a traumatic experience. Joseph is thrown into a pit. That's an emotionally traumatic experience. And that journey from the pit to the prison to the palace is really the what finding that healing is all about. So I only say that to say, I want to start with that, saying that as preachers, we are people, and as people, we are not exempt from that. And I want to play on that analogy that you just used with Superman as a fellow comic book collector. It's interesting that Superman's weakness was kryptonite, which was really a piece of his home planet.
Wow.
And so from everywhere else where he was amazing, it was stuff from home that did the most injury to him or made him the most vulnerable or susceptible.
I never knew that. Wow. Okay. And so what are some of the indicators that we're suffering with an unaddressed trauma? Like, what are some of the behaviors to look out for, some of the psychological tendencies that we may employ, but really don't know the root of it? Like, what are some of those indicators, you think?
Yeah, certainly. A trauma-informed perspective would be to understand that trauma has like three components, or three E's of trauma, as we tend to call them. There's the traumatic event, there's the traumatic experience, and then there's the traumatic effect. The traumatic event is the thing that happened that caused us injury, insult, hurt, sent us to a dark place. That's the event. The experience is how we processed it. And that's important because two people can experience the same event but not have the same inner experience. Two soldiers can be on the same battlefield with the same enemy and the same adversity and the same trenches, and one can leave that and return to civilian life with relative normalcy, if you will, while another one, the experience was totally different, even though they were at the same event. And then consequently, the effect is the observable behavior. So I say that to say that it's okay. We've been through a traumatic event, for example, or perhaps a better example is the pandemic. The pandemic is a traumatic event. It has the capability to cause injury. It was a different traumatic experience for some. Perhaps for some, it was physical. They actually contracted COVID. For others, it was bereavement of losing someone to COVID. For others, the trauma was financial in the form of a loss of livelihood or a change of how we took care of ourselves. So they're the traumatic experiences. For preachers, maybe it was the loss of
Right.
the way we normally did church, and having to
Mhm.
get used to preaching in empty sanctuaries and going online.
Right.
And so all of those are forms of loss. And so it was different experiences for everybody with different effects. So it's important that we as clergy know that we have had a traumatic event, and different ones of us have responded to that differently. And so we can't judge each other, just get the help we need to get through and keep moving. And the point is that even though for some, the
Mhm.
event is over, the
Yeah.
experience and effects can still continue, which is the whole idea behind post-traumatic stress.
Wow. Wow. And listening to that, I myself have a hard time self-assessing. I can feel something, but because I'm moving and I'm operating, I'm being depended upon as the stronger Superman person, that self-assessing and really doing a deep dive into what's happening most times doesn't happen, and just living with that. So what would you say about the self-assessing to make sure that you're whole, or that you're addressing what could be there?
Sure. But one is the importance of, and I don't say this with pretense, but I'm grateful to God for this burden He's giving you, Pastor Spry,
Mhm.
because the dialogue and the conversation and the raising of awareness lets us know that these are very human experiences. It doesn't make us weak. It doesn't make us inferior. It makes us human.
Yeah.
Uh, with both strengths and vulnerabilities that come with being human,
Right.
inclusive as preachers. When we look through the Bible, we see men of great strength and
Mhm.
women of great strength, and women with great and men and women with great vulnerabilities that God uses in spite of. So it's okay to not be okay. What is not okay is to not be okay and not know it and not get the help that we need.
Right.
Having said that, some of the things we can look for, just quick, sleep disruption, a
Mhm.
loss of interest in things that usually used to be of interest to us, low energy,
Yeah.
difficulty concentrating, distractibility, those kind of things, loss of weight, loss of appetite, gaining weight, all those kind of things are things that we can talk about with someone who
Mhm.
can, as possible, lead us towards further enlightenment and awareness if there's anything serious that needs to be taken care of.
Oh, wow. Wow. And so as a preacher, and listening to preaching, and I do know sometimes, and from my personal experience, that sometimes it affects how we preach. I would push and say, I think sometimes it affects how we interpret scripture. Right. And so I want to ask you this. I don't know if it's a crazy question, but something that entered my mind. How does unhealed trauma affect our hermeneutical lens as well as our homiletical approach? Does it bleed over into that when we have something that's unaddressed within us?
A profoundly relevant question. I'm gonna, because God's giving you a burden for ministering to fellow preachers and persons, men and women in the clergy vocations. I'm going to use some sermonic or contextual illustrations to show how there is psychological content in the scriptures.
Okay.
Your question is, how can that affect our hermeneutic? Uh,
Right.
there's a passage in Exodus 20, I believe, where it talks about Israel being in the wilderness and Miriam dies,
Hmm.
and the people are thirsty, and they start complaining to Moses. Moses, of course, has now got complaining people. He's leading a congregation. That's stressful. They're in
Hmm.
the wilderness. That's stressful. And then sister dies.
Right.
Certainly, there's some kind of reaction to that.
Hmm.
The Bible doesn't say it, but if we were to look at it, if Moses was sitting in a session, then the question might be posed to him to connect that, because Miriam was one of those significant women in his life that even when he was hiding in the reeds, it was Miriam who watched out for him.
Right.
And so when you have this kind of loss, does that affect you? It
Right.
is right behind that that Moses goes into the presence of God and prays, and God says, "Speak to the rock." Moses comes out and he strikes the rock
Right.
twice
Right.
instead of speaking to the rock.
Hmm.
And he takes out a pretty corrective homily on the people.
Right.
And so it begs the question, does our unaddressed trauma and loss and grief and bereavement affect how we hear God?
Right. Wow. Yes.
And
Yes.
subsequently how we preach to the people of God?
Right.
Even if the message is still what it needs to be. In counseling, we have a saying that's called framing, and how we frame an issue is everything. So
Right.
whether we frame it in correction or whether we frame it in the truth and love, or what, so even if we hear God clearly, the question is still posed as to whether we get the right framing if we have this unaddressed trauma.
Right. So the effect of our emotions, our psychological state, how do we look at it from that particular angle, to know that emotionally I'm not healthy, psychologically I'm not healthy? What are some of those? I know I asked that, but just a little more in depth with that. How do we pay attention to our emotional state as well as our psychological state, to really dive into what's really happening within us as clergy?
Um, uh, because we are spiritual beings first, I would say some of that comes through the discipline of prayer.
Right.
And I don't mean that in the pop catch-all drive-through, make your petition known and kind of drive off from the drive-through.
Right.
But I mean that in the early church, they used to talk about dimensions of prayer, the early church fathers, that there was the part where we're conversational and where we're leading, and then there's the part that is meditated, where we are actually still and allowing God to speak. And so some of that is when we wrestle. We even see that modeled in Jesus's Gethsemane prayer, where he's wrestling, even to the point that sweat is falling like blood, as the scriptures say, till it gets to the nevertheless. And that's that point. So some of that is through the prayer life, when it really is the discipline of contemplative prayer and spiritual formation, where we ask God to show us ourselves, and we stay long enough without falling asleep to hear God respond. Right. So some of that is that, and then that begins to connect the dots to the other things I mentioned, to irritability, low energy, difficulty concentrating, loss of interest. If you're going through some of those things, accountability circles, if your friend's spouse, children telling you you're cranky or you're short, give some consideration to that, at least to look within. And so I know we're used to diagnosing, quote unquote, I use that word very lightly. I know we're used to assessing and discerning and diagnosing other people, but it's turning that spotlight inward and being open to the fact that there are some people who are, as Nathan was to David, or as Moses was to Pharaoh, able to kind of tell us about ourselves and being open to hearing that.
So that would lead to, how important is accountability when it comes to unhealed trauma? Like how important is that?
Yeah. It's essential.
Right.
To that question. Those kinds of relationships where people can speak the truth to us in love, and we can hear that and take it under advisement. The Bible even says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend." Right. So even if it hurts, it's coming from a place that it is purpose to heal. And so that accountability, as I said, having not just, we're used to having proteges and people that we pour into, but we need people that pour into us in terms of mentors. Pastors need pastors. Right. There was counselors, therapists have therapists. Really? After counseling and being therapeutic with everyone else, even therapists say that someone I need to talk to, and clinical supervision is an important part of that process. Pastors could do well to learn by that as well. And so that's that. So to answer your question, that's a long way of saying it's essential that we have those accountability circles.
Right. So just like you said, it's essential for us pastors to have pastors. When I grew up Pentecostal, rigid Pentecostal. And so everything had to be addressed by the power of God, which I totally believe in that theology. But then as we move now, therapy and having a therapist is more of the conversation. that collective piece, and really your book as well, clergy and therapy, how important it is for us to have a therapist on hand.
I would see that as an extension of the power of God. We both similarly have Pentecostal backgrounds,
Right.
or even if you have autonomous Baptist backgrounds, or whatever, that kind of like I got my own direct connection and all that kind of thing. Priesthood of all believers and all those other things that, when taken to extremes, can actually hinder us from experiencing a fuller witness from God. I say that to say that instead of seeing the therapist or the pastoral figure as something separate from the power of God, see it as a vessel of the power of God.
Right.
That the same God who spoke through people in the scriptures is the same God who can speak. And that's humbling for us to embrace, but it's a good humility to know that, yes, we are called as preachers to be spokespersons for God. They're called to give sermons and messages. Yes, we operate in those offices, the apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher. We understand that. But God has also other people through whom he speaks.
Right.
And so God can speak through the wisdom of a therapist that is yielded to his will. Yeah. And so that's not in addition to the power of God, because then those who come from theological backgrounds would wrestle with that, because we have to accommodate the absolute sufficiency of Christ into our equation here. That anytime there's healing happening, it is the healer is Christ.
Wow. Yeah.
And the human agent is merely the vessel, whether it's a physician, body, or the mind. They are or the spirit. They are but vessels through which the power of God. There's only one healer, but there are many vessels.
Many vessels. And that's a great perspective. I don't want to seem like I'm regressing. Why do you think it's hard for us to admit that we need help?
That has several reasons, and then some of them are cultural, and then some of them are cultural within or subcultures. Number one, there's the Western ideology of autonomy, and the whole not to dismiss this great poem, but the whole Invictus thing, that I'm the master of my own fate and my own destiny, and I make it happen for me, and I pick myself up by my own bootstraps, and all of that kind of emphasis on individualism and autonomy that is perhaps a little skewed in Western ideology, as opposed to some other cultures that are more collectivist in its perspective. And so some of that is me, like I can heal me and I can do it by myself. Then others of it is culture within a culture. For those of us that come from historically oppressed cultural demographics, there's this idea that we need to have a higher pain threshold. And that we need to be able to refute any kinds of feelings of inferiority that have been put in our psyche by way of our traumatic experiences. And so we're going to take it. We can do it. Just me and the Lord. And me not realizing that me and the Lord, again, the Lord piece can come through many expressions. There's one healer. Me and the Lord can do it through me, the Lord, and a physician. And so
that was amazing, and I think we all can glean from that, because once again, it's the Clark Kent Superman syndrome, where we feel like because we have some sort of power, some sort of autonomy, as you stated, that we have the ability to just kind of keep moving without addressing what could be laying dormant within us. And I'll ask you this, and this will be my last question before we close out our time together. How do we get to the root of the issue? If there is an issue, how do we get to the root of
it? Usually with help would be the, and I say that because there's an adage in counseling disciplines that we seldom see our own pathology.
Okay.
We're less apt to see that. For us, the defense mechanism or the coping strategy that we employ seems to be what's necessary for the experience at hand.
Right.
But in a sense, you could define certain forms of mental illness as a misappropriated coping strategy.
Wow.
What's an effective coping strategy in the wars or the jungles of Vietnam in a war is not a good coping strategy stateside and at peace. So it's a maladaptive issue. And so we seldom see that. Now, Bible for that, certainly. Jesus put it this way, which is the theological precedent for the psychological premise I just gave. Jesus said it's easier to see a speck in somebody else's eye than it is to see a beam in our own, which is the same thing to say we don't see our own stuff as well as we see others. So usually some kind of conversation is helpful, whether that be, and it doesn't have to jump right to intensive therapy. There's nothing wrong with ever just seeing a therapist or a doctor, just as you say, to keep things preventive maintenance and just but in times of trauma, it's not necessarily you got to run right there. In fact, the offices are so overwhelmed today, you might have to wait a week or two for an appointment, depending on where in the area you're calling. But in the interim, certainly conversations with accountability circles, friends to whom we talk, spending time with God, spiritual community, pastoral figures and pastoral care. There are levels of accountability that we can pursue to just kind of keep ourselves as healthy as possible.
Right. Thank you so much, Bishop. Thank you so very, very much for helping us, giving us not only the spiritual side, but the natural side as well, and then the theories and the concepts that I think we all can apply to better ourselves as preachers, as clergy, to get down to, if we do have, some tendencies that are connected to some sort of trauma, that we can get some accountability partners, get a therapist, one that can, of course, help guide us through. Thank you so very much. I want to, before we end, I want to end with this quote that I sing today. I think it's a familiar quote that I've heard before. It says, if you never heal from what hurt you, you'll bleed on the people that didn't cut you. So, Bishop, what you say about that? And we'll close with that.
Certainly. That's amen. so do what you need to do, have the conversations you need to have, because healing begins with a conversation. Freud called it the talking cure. And so it begins with a conversation. Doesn't make you weak. It makes you in pursuit of strength.
Right. Wow. All right. So the Monday after Preachers Podcast, we're so grateful to have Bishop Guy Robinson on. He's given us great insight. I do want to start a book club. Bishop, what's your favorite book? I want your favorite book. Not what you currently read. I'm talking about your favorite book.
Oh my goodness.
I see your library in the back. You got a whole bunch of books in the back. What's your favorite book?
I'm resisting a powerful urge to say critical collaboration.
No, say it, Bishop.
Man, you've asked a good question. I just love to read, Pastor Spry. So all of them are good. But
give us a few then. Let me take the pressure off you. Leading with critical collaboration. That should be number one. I'm sorry.
Well, critical collaboration is all about, of course, how to this ministry of mental health and how to walk into the little more. There's also a great book by Steve Blowen. I can't remember the name of it, but it is a pastor's guide to mental health.
Okay.
And it's just a very basic book of what to look for so that we can recognize when mental health concerns are presented to us in the context of doing ministry and serving others. That's a very good book as well. And I'll stop right there. But Yeah, I'll send you some.
Thank you so very much, Bishop, for your time and agreeing to come. I know we had some scheduling conflict, but we finally got it done. I wanted you to have you on as the first guest because I knew you would give some helpful insight, pushing us forward. Thank you so very much, Bishop, for being on the Monday After Preachers podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.